Welcome back, everyone. I'm Laura Weaver, Director of Professional Development with Campus Compact. I'm excited to be back with you today, Tuesday, July 14th, for our second session of Story Seeds with Megan Lovely. I know that last week was a great session, and I have been thinking so much about everything that Megan shared with us last week. And I'm very excited to dig deeply into what Megan has to share with us this week as we continue on the journey about Megan's most recent book, which is called Story Seeds. Growing Home at the Farmer's Market, which again is a book that combines personal memoir and scholarship around stories that were collected over a 4-year period from the 32nd Street Farmers Market in Baltimore. This week, Megan is going to really share how storytelling can be used to ground classroom dialogue and generate assignments that reflect the student's lived experience, which I know for a lot of folks is something that we are always looking to help students do, and to really connect that classroom experience with their own personal experiences. I know she has a really great discussion planned and activities planned to help us all really think about and explore how to analyze and deconstruct those binary narratives, as well as to recognize limitations and to engage with and articulate the more nuanced and complex realities that reflect diverse experiences and perspectives. Again, I know you are not here to listen to me yammer on. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Megan, and she is going to get us started. Megan, it's all you now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. And it's wonderful to be with you all this afternoon. I recognize some of your names um, in the Zoom boxes from last week. So thank you for coming back if this is your second week. And thank you for those of you joining for the first time. Um, Laura, just want to double check. Can you see my screen that I'm sharing? Just a thumbs up
Yep, I can
or
see your
yes?
screen.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit more introductions and how we'll be spending our time together today. But first, wanted to offer just a transition into our time together. So I've written this Future Stories acknowledgement, which is inspired by Amalia Doloni, who is a self-described relational futurist and designer of collective imagination. So how this will work is I'll read it, and it's an opportunity for us to set our collective intention together, for you to take some deep breaths, adjust yourself in your seat, and just transition from wherever you were previously before 12:06 and help us ground us for these next 53 minutes together. So. We acknowledge that the stories we tell today were seeded by those who came before us and may shape the landscape for those who come after us. We share our stories with this in mind. We honor the sacred nature of story through our attention, how we listen, how we make meaning, and how we choose to act based on the stories we hear and the stories we share. We recognize that stories hold power and that everyone has the right to share their story. At the same time, we acknowledge that these stories will continue beyond our telling, that these stories are not something to own, but something to share, and that in sharing, they may take on new meaning. In sharing, we open ourselves up to the possibility of adaptation and collective imagination. We take the dandelion puff and we blow, our stories scattered to seed the next generation of storytellers. All right, everybody. So, as Laura said, my name is Megan Lovely. I use she, her pronouns. I am a social practice artist, educator, and a community engagement professional. I'm connected to Campus Compact through my role as a program manager and instructor for community engaged learning at the University of Rochester. And today's session, because it is so focused on how to bring this practice into the classroom, really out of the four sessions draws most heavily on how I've since moving, because this project predates my time in Rochester. How I've since applied my work in Baltimore at this farmers market through this hands-on project and brought it into the classroom with my students. I'm going to take a moment just to say that all photographs in this presentation are credit to Michael Caballés, who is the photographer for the Story Seeds book, and he happens to be my husband. Next week, he's actually joining us for a conversation about ethics of community engaged scholarship and how that relates to documenting community stories, both orally and visually through photography and in the writing and publishing process. So he'll be joining us next week for our conversation. How we'll be spending our time together today. So I'm going to spend today doing just a brief overview of how the book came to be. So how the Story Seeds project evolved into the Story Seeds book, and then how it's shifting into my work in the classroom. And then I'll do a brief reading from the book to help ground our conversation. I'll share some examples of different ways that I've applied it in the classroom and how other universities have already tried to apply the Story Seeds practice into their own work. We have a very mini workshop because this is an interactive storytelling project, and so it's hard for me to not include some sort of interactive component to this webinar. So there'll be an opportunity to do some sharing in that if you'd like, but it's completely optional. And then we will leave time for questions and answers at the end. So please hold any questions that you have or put them in the chat. Unless like you can't see something that I'm sharing or you can't hear me, do please come off camera or come off mute or type in the chat if you need to get my attention. So I'm gonna so rewind now about 10 years ago is really when I feel like the seeds of this project began. And I was a sophomore in college. I was studying at Denison University, and I was in an Intro to Black Studies class. And at this time, I was simultaneously assistant directing the piano lesson by August Wilson. And I remember having a conversation with my professor about how, like, this complexity I was feeling about how I could facilitate and support the actors, who was an all-black cast, and I was a white assistant director, and how I could facilitate the storytelling of this theater piece when I myself was not from that community, and could not connect to the stories that were being told on stage. And he very bluntly just asked me, well, why don't you write about yourself? And I really didn't give his question much thought at the time because I was so passionate about using theater to elevate the stories of marginalized individuals. And as a white woman, I really could not see could not see why I would want to use like my talent and my skills and my time to like promote stories of my own. And so fast forward to 2020, I was now in graduate school, still really passionate about using theater to elevate stories of marginalized communities. And in doing that, really wanted to work with a community partner. Um, but then I was started to get into this murky area of what do I even mean when I say community? Was it a group of people? Is it a place? And how can I be a community-based artist without a community to ground myself in? And so I arrived with all of these questions in Baltimore. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and the only place that I could find myself at was at this farmer's market down the street from my house. And after showing up there enough as a shopper then I started working at one of the vendor stands. I remember one of my thesis advisors suggested, well, what if the farmers market is your community partner for this work? And I took her because I didn't really have any other opportunities to meet other community partners. I decided to look more intentionally at the farmers market as a place where I could study really what became my thesis question of how does an artist build a new relationship with a community in a way that is reciprocal, especially juggling the complexities of like the identity as a as a white woman, as a student, as a newcomer to Baltimore, all identities which could have traditionally extractive relationships with the community. How can I get people to actually trust me, want to work with me when I am new to this place? And what I found is that by working at the farmers market, I naturally was just in conversation with people across the spectrum of socioeconomic status and race and culture and age and and life circumstance, really, because I feel like when I look back on my intention and my impulse to want to use theater to elevate marginalized stories, it really, I think, connects to this bigger question of I don't want to just keep telling the same story over and over again. I don't want what I'm really interested in is in what happens with different stories encounter each other and how can we tell something new with that story. And I realized that the only way for me to actually tell this story, broader story of encountering, was to put myself in relationship with the people who I was talking with. And this wasn't to put myself at the center of the story, but rather to put myself in relationship with those who I was engaging with. And what I realized is that that actually was how I built the trust. That it was only, when people are asked, as I'm asking people, how long they've lived in Baltimore and how they, and why they choose to stay in Baltimore. They equally were interested in where I was coming from, where I was moving from, and why I chose to move there. And it was that exchange of stories that started to create this bi-directional exchange and relationship that helped me start to see this larger story of interdependence and connection at the farmers market and really seeing the market as a community hub where people from so many different walks of life can encounter each other. And so going off of this like thesis that I was starting to develop just based on being at the market every week, um, I really wanted to interview other people more intentionally about why do they show up at the farmers market and what role might storytelling be able to play in helping each of us build a stronger sense of connection and responsibility to the city of Baltimore. And so with permission from the market manager, I set up a story stand and I invited community members to share a moment, a feeling, or an image that shimmered for them from the farmers market. Um, Stories range from like the first time at the farmers market to their 655th time. They talked about practicing Spanish with a vendor when they weren't able to practice that being away from their family, just holding hands with their partner. And so I did this through initially for my thesis project, essentially as field research. And so I wasn't just actually asking people to orally share a story with me. I was asking them to physically represent this, and I'll have a slide in a moment that shows what the story seeds are. Because really, what the story seeds project is this physical uh, representation of a story on this wooden pendant called teardrop shaped pendant, which I call the story seed. And I asked people to distill whatever story they shared with me down into one image, a word, something that could represent that. And then ask them to do two of them. So one they would keep for themselves, and this idea that they are taking something with them at the same time they are offering something to me. And so by them offering it to me, I started to collect this visual documentation of I'll go back to this other slide in a moment, but just so you can see this visual documentation of all these stories that people are showing about why they show up to the farmers market. And it started to become a living document of how we show up, why we show up, and the community that we're all building and a part of. And so I, after finishing graduate school in 2022, I continued the project after starting a 9 to 5 administrative job right after grad school and really needing a community and social outlet, an artistic and a social outlet. And over the course of 3 years, I gathered more than 200 stories from community members and vendors, and collectively started to see this broader story, these themes emerging of the market as a place where people can gather to get necessary resources for social connection and for communal care. So these are just a few more photographs of the Story Seed stands. This was in like June of 2020. three. And so I started with just an open air table, and then eventually I got a tent. And so children were very frequent storytellers at these stands, lots of abstract representations of favorite market treats. So then fast forward now to 2024, and my husband and I have made the decision to move to Rochester, New York, to be closer to his great aunt. And I was feeling this great responsibility to share back what I had gathered, what people had trusted me with, their stories, their time, their attention, over the course of those 3.5 years. And thinking again, this idea of not wanting to just be this artist that comes in, that does a project and then leaves and doesn't have anything to show to the community for all the time that they spent. And so for me, I'm a writer. And that is the way that I make meaning and I connect stories together. And so I decided to publish it into a book. And I was fortunate that my husband, Michael, had been documenting the project all along, not knowing we would put it into a book. And they really add a beautiful visual accompaniment to the story. So I'm going to transition now into actually reading an excerpt from the book from this chapter called Ministry of Hello. And that is a term that was coined by Barbie Maniscalco, who works at this bakery called Uptown Baker. So she's in the pink sweatshirt here and on the left of the photograph. And you'll hear it described in her own words. But I've chosen this chapter for this session because it points to the market as this place of belonging, of welcome, which, as we'll talk about later in the session, really thinking about how to help students find a sense of belonging in their in the cities beyond their immediate campus bubble, as well as how they can themselves be good stewards of the places that they are calling home for the 4 years or more that they are at university. So to do this, I'm going to stop sharing my presentation for a moment and actually switch over to a PDF of my, just a PDF of the book so you can see how the text accompanies the photographs. And also, if you like to read along, you can read along or close your eyes, however you like to listen. All right. Our last Saturday in Baltimore, Mike and I invited our friends to join us at the 32nd Street Farmers Market for a goodbye gathering in Waverly Commons, a renovated lot owned by Waverly Main Street on the periphery of the market. We set up at one of the round wooden tables with chocolate chip cookies. Friends passed through, each of them reflecting the community we had built in Baltimore. More than saying goodbye to individual people, on that day I felt like I needed to say a proper goodbye to the market, the place that had made Baltimore feel like home. Exchanging stories with people at Story Seed stands contextualized my experience at the market within a larger story of welcome, consistency, and belonging. Quote, "You don't have to make an appointment to meet anyone at the market. You can just show up and be," said one community member. The market is a place of unexpected conversations and encounters. As another community member said, quote, "Never know what or who I'll talk about or to. One Saturday, I learned popsicle is a trademark," end quote. This is why CM Pops, the ice pop vendor, calls his items ice pops, she explained. When Grace visited the market for the first time, she didn't have cash, so a stranger paid for her produce. She wanted to pay it forward. There was so much Cynthia wanted to capture on her seed, like presents. The market was here, in person, consistently, all throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Waverly Commons was updated with the colorful installations during the pandemic in response to Baltimore City Mayor Jack Young's Design for Distance initiative, quote, "a tactical urban design initiative intended to help small businesses reopen without compromising public health," end quote. Bo Brent, co-owner of Max's Degrees and executive director of the 32nd Street Farmers Market, throughout the pandemic, fought the installations because of the amount of space they took up. But there is one moment he remembered that changed his mind. Quote, "It was this one moment after a year and a half of everything that was going on. The stress, everything I had dealt with fighting to keep this market open. I was walking through Waverly Commons and there was a musician playing. People had set up chess at different tables. People were smiling, sitting, eating. It felt like home. It was a beautiful moment in the past year. End quote. I will be forever grateful to the staff who fought to keep the 32nd Street Farmers Market open throughout the pandemic, and the vendors who showed up week after week. Having moved to Baltimore in December 2020, the market was critical in welcoming me to my new community. Quote, I feel like I've gotten to have a storefront without having a storefront because it's a consistent place that people know they can come. And you're welcoming them, said Barbie Maniscalco of Uptown Bakers. Barbie started vending at the Baltimore Farmers Market downtown in the fall of 1993. She started at the 32nd Street Farmers Market the following spring after meeting Barbara Lonstein from Neopole Savory Smokery, who agreed to let Uptown Bakers share half of their vendor space. Barbie takes the responsibility of welcoming people seriously, calling it her Ministry of Hello. Even when there's a long line, Barbie encourages her team to take the time to talk with customers about whatever is important to them, whether that be questions about allergens, how to navigate the market, or what they choose to spend their allowance on. Quote, we're ambassadors. People say it's their first time at the market, and it's like, have a pastry on us. Barbie's welcome emphasizes that they're not just welcoming people to the 32nd Street Farmers Market, but to Baltimore more broadly. Quote, I recently had a mom who was moving his son in for his first job, and all three of us at the stand were like, we all have sons. He's in good hands. Don't worry. End quote. Quote, every week we always have somebody new because this is a transition area, from Hopkins to people moving into the area, said Bernard Hudnall from Natural Aromatics. The market is just 1 mile from the Johns Hopkins University Homewood campus, and yet many students stay confined to their Hopkins bubble. Quote, there's a saying about the Hopkins bubble. A lot of students don't go off campus because everything is right there. But getting out and exploring past that is where a lot of the shaping comes from. A lot of who you become and what you know comes from outside of a bubble. End quote, reflected Sarah Kaufman. She first visited the market as part of her first year orientation at Johns Hopkins University. She created a joint story seed with 2 other students in her orientation to commemorate their first day. In an interview with the Johns Hopkins University newsletter, Stuart Schrader, Associate Research Professor of Africana Studies and Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, explained the history and context behind the bubble. Quote, the Hopkins bubble isn't just a Hopkins phenomenon. It is actually a part of a broader set of limitations, barriers, and restrictions in Baltimore City, he said, including the historical redlining in the city. Related factors that maintain the bubble include inequitable access to public transportation, distrust toward the university within Baltimore's Black community, and the university's safety policies. When I started working at the University of Rochester, I learned that students there felt a similar divide, pointing toward a larger pattern of division and distrust between metropolitan and urban universities and their communities. Students like Sarah are committed to disrupting that pattern. During her winter break, she met me to reflect on her first day at the 32nd Street Farmers Market, her first semester of college, and her different experiences of finding community in Argentina, Florida, and Baltimore. So I'm going to stop our reading there. There is an abridged transcript of the full interview in the book, and there are a few instances in the book where I include full in-depth interviews with community partners to add more community voices to the book, which are otherwise a threading together of lots of one-off comments, moments, memories that I got at the story stands because those were shorter interactions. But I'm going to go ahead and reshare my presentation. Okay. So there is one quote that I want to highlight from the um, interview that I had with Sarah, and I'm just going to read it from the screen. She said, I met some people from Baltimore at the farmers market, and they called it Smalltimore. Hearing that was good because it went against so much of what I was warned about living here, about the crime and the dangers and how you don't want to get off campus because it could be dangerous. Getting out and seeing the people who chose to move here, spend time here, and see it as a home has been really nice. So her reflection was not unique. I heard it not just from her, but from others who had moved there either as students or just as community members. I know it's something I certainly faced when I was telling people that I was going to Baltimore for graduate school. And it's really then that I started to become interested in how can storytelling help us move beyond these simplistic narratives of danger and crime. Because not to say that they're not true, but as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says in her TED Talk about the danger of a single story, that the problem with these stereotypes is that they're incomplete. And so thinking about how can stories help us develop a more complex narrative of the city of Baltimore. And because at the farmers market, there's so many people who are coming together for different reasons, the market, whether that is because they want to, they need to buy their weekly groceries and maybe they need to use their SNAP benefits and they can use those at the market. Or maybe they're meeting up with friends or family. It's part of a weekly routine. Or maybe they are just looking for some familiarity. I mean, I think for me, that's why I showed up every week, is I was looking for some consistency throughout the pandemic. And the market was there every week. And so what happened is that through all these stories, and seeing all these stories together, it's impossible to only have a single version of not just the farmers market, but of the city of Baltimore. And for Sarah, students like Sarah, getting off campus allowed her to see people who are actually making the city home and seeing that, oh, there are people who live here, who care about here, and who are invested in making this a vibrant place to live. And so these photos on the screen are a group of students who were working for the summer at Johns Hopkins University as student teachers, and they were coming from all over. Some were coming from Miami, some were that's the only one that I'm seeing actually articulated here. But for many of them, it was their first encounter with the city of Baltimore. And I'm going to read this on this day that I met these students. I had a postcard activity where I asked them to write love letters to the farmers market. And this one to me really stood out as how the market can be a place of belonging for college students. So this postcard says, Dear Market, hello again. I'm not sure you remember me, but I remember you from last year when an instructor, what was their name, told me to come see you and I found hala and joy. So, hello again, and thanks again. Thank you for creating in me the sense of community I often feel I've lost. Thank you for disorientation, for delightful confusion. Thank you for permitting me to lose myself and lose and find and find and find. So, after I moved to the University of Rochester, and I was working directly with students, and as I reflected in the book, that I was seeing the same narrative of students feeling this distrust towards the community off campus, and even some students not realizing that they are actually in the city of Rochester, because they felt so confined by their campus bubble. They didn't actually see it as part of the city. And so I was curious about, like, really from the last 2 years, I've been looking at how can the story seeds practice be applied in the classroom to help university students feel a greater sense of belonging and responsibility to their college towns. And the way there are multiple entry points into how this work can be applied, and I've divided it up into 3 questions. It can be used as an entry point into students' work with their off-campus community, thinking about where are they coming from and their personal engagement experiences or their own hometowns, cultures, backgrounds. It can be used as a reflection point in terms of how are they shaped by their new community and simultaneously how are they shaping their community? So what is that reciprocal relationship? And then how are they carrying their community forward? So really that is like, what is the legacy that they're wanting to leave for their community? And the Story Seeds book is for myself is my own answer to that question. So this slide is an example of how I've incorporated this into the classroom as an entry point. And so as part of my role as program manager for community engaged learning, I teach community engagement 101 workshops to different classes, workshops, different student groups for like best practices in community engagement. And I use this a version of the Story Seeds exercise to prompt students to think about what is a meaningful engagement experience that they have had with with an off with a community. And so often students might reflect on an experience they had in high school or maybe something they've done with a student organization. But I use that as an entry point to then facilitate the rest of the workshop about best practices, really trying to say, listen, you already have these experiences. How can you build on these experiences and why were they meaningful and what made them meaningful? So that's thinking about how to use storytelling as a way to ground lectures in the students' lived experiences. I've This is an like probably the first time I did the workshop. At this point, there are more than 30 seeds on here. So it's also for those of you who are interested in like any sort of program evaluation or documenting the impact and scope of your work. Each seed also it's like its own little data point of, oh, look at all the students that we have reached. Or you can also look at them collectively and start to think about what are some of the common themes that my students are coming into the classroom with, and what is important for me to address when I'm talking with them about engaging with off-campus communities. The second slide, when we're talking about this reciprocal change that happens and is inevitable in community engagement, is photographs from a community conversation I facilitated through the Center for Community Engagement at Rochester. And it was in particular focusing on third spaces. And so how we find third spaces outside of the campus bubble. So the whole chapter ministry of Hello really is about the farmers market as a third space, which was defined, a term coined by Ray Oldenburg to describe these places that are homes away from home, where you have no obligations, and really feel a sense of ownership too. And so I asked students to reflect on what are their favorite off-campus places and how can that be used to complicate the narrative that off-campus is an unsafe place to travel to. And then this fourth question of how do I carry my community forward is a question about it in talking with my students. We always talk about, what are you going to leave behind? And how are you going to make sure that you're not just parachuting in, doing a project, and then leaving? And this is particularly relevant for the certificate program that I oversee, where for community engaged learning, where students are developing a capstone project in collaboration with the with a community partner to expand the capacity of that organization in some way. And so one of the questions when reviewing the proposals we ask the students is, what's the sustainability of this project? And so on a smaller scale, in the class that I teach, Intro to Community Engaged Scholarship, I asked students to do again a version of the story seeds practice, but really instead of this like documentation of existing stories and memory, thinking forward and actually using storytelling as intention setting for how we want to engage with our communities. And this is based on I include the quote from Tania Mitchell in her article about traditional versus critical service learning. When she talks about the critical service learning moves beyond this simply of doing service, and challenges students to, quote, articulate their own visions for a more just society and investigate and contemplate actions that propel society towards those visions. So I ask students to draw a seed of what is their vision for a more just society after we do this at the very end of the semester after we've learned about the city of Rochester with all of its challenges and assets. And then what is an action that they can personally take to propel society toward that vision? And so the seeds on this slide are examples of what students have created in response to those questions. And then this is just an example of how some other universities, how I've worked with other universities to apply this to their work. It's been applied everywhere from honor societies, looking at leadership as an emergent practice, looking at how it can be used in student leaders orientations, such as the University of Arkansas, and then how storytelling can also be used for qualitative research. So going back to that, if you're interested in how storytelling can be used as data, that's not a focus of today's presentation. But if you're interested in talking more about that with me, feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to chat with you about that. Okay, so we are at the mini workshop session. So we're going to have about the next 10 minutes or so to actually think through, and I got ahead of myself with the questions. Um, Engage with some of this material yourselves. Time to do some reflection, some writing. Um, And so, if you are someone who likes to write to get your thoughts down, I invite you to get a piece of paper and a writing utensil, or you can also just ponder these, um, ponder these in your head. So, the first question for our workshop is one, think of the city or town where you're currently living, and what is an issue that your city or town faces? So, how it's going to work, I'm going to ask a series of questions, and then we'll do some sharing at the very end. Okay. So then for the city or town that you are thinking about, imagine a story that illustrates this issue. And now imagine this being published on the front page of your local newspaper. If someone who doesn't live in your city or town or know anything about it were to read this news story, what assumptions might they make about your city or town? And now going back to that concept of third space, think of a favorite third space in your city or town, your home away from home where you feel a sense of belonging and connection to. This often it might be a coffee shop, it might be a park, a library, any place that you can see others in community. And now imagine a story about this third space being published on the front page of that same local newspaper. And if someone who wasn't from your city or town or didn't know anything about it, if they were to see this story, what assumptions might they make about your city or town? All right. If you're still writing, that's okay. But I am going to open it up for thinking about how are you compare the assumptions from this first news story to the second. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can see the gallery view. And if anyone's interested in sharing, I would love to hear a couple folks share about the comparing those two stories. The one that is about a local challenge that faces your city, and then a local third space, and how encountering those two stories might share a very different narrative about your city. And feel free, you can either raise your hand or just come off mute or type in the chat if yes, okay, I see a hand raised. I'm sorry, can you pronounce your name for me, please?
Urmi,
Ulmi
Urmi, yeah.
or me? Thank you.
So it's interesting, when I thought of the problem, it was very, deficit, negative, energy that was reflected. And when I thought of the, second question, it was almost like so positive, like someone who would read that would want to go, oh, we better move to Pittsburgh.
hmm So what is the can you share a little bit more about the town or city that you're
So
describing and
I
what?
live in Pittsburgh, and the
Okay.
issue that I the first thing that came to my mind was the food deserts and the lack of, fresh produce available to everyone. And when I came from the problem mindset, the headline was, it's like you can't even get the basic necessities in the city. And then when
hmm
you asked to imagine a place where I felt like I belonged, the first thought that came to my head was my Pilates studio,
Mm-hmm.
where, I go to practice. I mean, I don't own that place. I'm just a member. And everyone loves, there is so much warmth, happiness, and, all the multiple injuries that people have suffered and they have recovered because you want to get better to get there. And it's a interwoven place where everyone is focused on health and wellness.
Mm,
And it just changed the whole tenor. And so, it's very obvious that when we come from that place of problem, what happens, and then when to us and our thinking, and it becomes much narrower. So my story kind of becomes a tragedy that I myself don't want to share,
mm,
versus when I have to talk about something that I'm excited about. There is so much I want to share, and it's so open, and it welcomes other people to get into it.
mm. And I think what's powerful is that like that is something you can speak to personally. That is, you're saying this is my personal experience and how that's the power of a personal story. Rather than just, you could go out and interview other people about why they love the city of Pittsburgh or their favorite third places, but the impact of it coming from you and your first person experience. Um, And that's something that I learned through exchanging stories at the farmers market. It was, eventually when I first started the project, I didn't feel like I had enough of my own stories to share about why I loved the market. And so I just baked a bunch of muffins and asked people to swap a story for a muffin. So that's what I had to share at first. But eventually I had my own stories about Farmer Joan and the like where who I like to get my apples from, and I was able to offer those um as an exchange, um and in so doing started to feel more connected.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love, Laura, you're highlighting. I love how you said my Pilates studio, even though you don't own it. That speaks volumes about belonging in this
Yeah.
space. And that is one of the key qualities of a third space is that there starts to be this sense of ownership. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Would anyone else like to share? Yep, Karen?
Hey there, I can share. So I'm in Framingham, Massachusetts, and there is a lot that happens here, but I am not like fully invested in I'm not active in the community, so to speak. Um, but what I was thinking of, what is an issue that is facing our town? It kind of passed because we typically have been having this Stars and Stripes over Framingham. It's been this wonderful event at the 4th of July that one of the military bands, an Army band, a Navy band, what comes and plays. There's different local groups that play music. There's food trucks. It's really bringing everybody together. Um, and since my kids have stopped playing Little League because they're now in college, I don't have that sense of going to an area where there's a lot of people from Framingham together. We kind of have all dispersed. Like when the kids kind of grow up, I feel like I disperse. Other than I don't go to a Pilates studio, I will go to Zumba, which is another place that I feel like I can at least connect. But this issue it's like they canceled it. Like, and here it is. Here it was, right? The 250th celebration, but they canceled it for funding. And I'm like, everybody was like so sad. It was like, well,
Hmm.
now what am I going to do for 4th of July? I am 20 minutes outside of Boston, which has like a huge 4th of July event, yearly, right? The Boston Pops, the fireworks. But it's been so wonderful for the city of Framingham to bring everybody together. There has been so much talk about it. But then, like, when thinking about that third space, I thought of my Zumba studio that I go to, you know, infrequently, but regularly infrequently, where I'm with people of the community. But it still brought me back, even though that third space was like the baseball fields that we used to go to. It was more like melancholy, right? That the loss of this event, also thinking of what made me feel connected to the community, was also lost. Even though there were other areas, I can go to a cafe, like this Bee Sisters
Hmm.
Cafe. I go in there because I used to go there all during COVID. I felt a place of belonging, a sense of belonging, but really feeling like that sense of belonging to Framingham, that space of not having the 4th of July also spoke volumes.
Mm.
So it was like
Mm.
the same space, but I saw it from two different perspectives.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it makes me wonder what would happen if there were more stories like that you shared about how much that means and how I'm curious about, I don't know all, you said it was for funding, but I'm curious about like if all these stories about why it matters and how, if there was enough community support or engagement with the community and making that decision, if it might have swayed a different a different direction. Um, and I think that's where storytelling can have a tangible impact on our community assets. And when we talk about like asset-based community development, stories are one of those assets and the stories that residents hold. And so the assets are, I think what you're talking about, Karen, is yes, the festival itself, the infrastructure of the festival was itself an asset, but the stories that were attached to it and the cultural memory that that creates and the sense of belonging and community, like that itself is an asset. And I think sometimes those assets aren't always considered when having to make critical funding decisions, or seeing, like, and I think that's where still the nut I'm trying to crack is how to make the economic argument for storytelling, when it doesn't, especially to funders who are concerned about, what's going to make the most income. Thank you. Yes, and our relational interactions are an asset. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So I'm going to transition it now into just Q&A. So we have about 9 minutes left. And so if there's anything folks want to ask a question about anything we've talked about today, learn more about the Story Seeds process, anything, ways about how to apply it in the classroom, anything that is percolating top of mind that you'd like to share. Can also be a continuation of this conversation we've started.
Megan, I have a
Yes.
question. How are you doing?
Good, Phil.
That was
Thanks.
that was really great. I'm just curious what more you can say to explain why the process requires the inclusion of a third space. And I'm
Mm.
just curious what you'll say
Mm.
to answer that because it's I think it's really deep, but it's not that obvious to me because like for example in that exercise we could have gone through the exercise without there being like stop and think about your third space. Like there's some problem in the town and there's the headline and what people assume from the headline, and then you flip the headline, uh, that by coming up with some way to um, and so on. So
Hmm.
why the third space specifically?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think For me, the third space is so important because it shifts us from a deficit to an asset-based framework of when we're talking about our cities and towns. And like something when I attended, Phil, you and I were at the International Placemaking Week in Detroit just 2 weeks ago, and I attended a workshop about place-based storytelling. And the facilitator, Jeanette Pierce, talked about like assets and deficits exist simultaneously. They're not mutually exclusive. And so I think that for me, and like my work since I've shifted more towards community engaged learning and higher ed is very influenced by asset-based community development. And so I'm I think the third space is necessary and rather than yes, like we could have had this conversation about here's this issue in the city. Okay, now let's flip it. Now this issue's been solved by this grant funding or by this project or by but rather than just looking at communities as these issues to be solved, thinking about what exists next to these issues. And so actually the focus isn't all necessarily all on let's fix this issue, but let's like uplift what's already there. Um, and for me, I add that question about reflecting about our third spaces because I that to me is the easiest entry point into thinking about why why we love their cities and towns. And I think that I had a joke with a friend of mine who was studying at the University of Rochester, getting her PhD, and she was really resistant. Really did not like the city of Rochester. And I said, it is my job to help you find some place that you love here. And she did. She walked and like when we were like dig into it a little more, she's like, well, I really like this tailor that I bring all my clothes to. I'm like, that's amazing. You have a relationship with a tailor who like knows you by name and you bring in for clothes recommendations. And so I think that that's that's why the third space for me it's an easy entry point into adding this important dimension to how we talk about our cities.
Okay. Okay.
Is
Thank you
there a
for that.
follow-up to that? Does that like are
No, I
you
mean, I
still
could see how it emerged from your
okay?
work with the market in Baltimore, but then
Hmm.
it's, yeah, no, but I get it. It sort of roots the problem in a place and time that matters to you that you can then sort of get passionate about, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you reflecting that language back specifically, it roots it to a place and time that is personal to you and that you're going to feel a personal investment to. So like talking about my Pilates studio. Well, if I feel a sense of ownership of my Pilates studio or my 4th of July celebration, well, and I hear that it's threatened, I'm going to feel compelled to go and advocate for why it matters.
Mhm.
Whereas if I don't have a personal connection to it and I just read about it in the newspaper, I might be like, oh, that's a shame. It's losing an important in a an important public space.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yes, I see you have another question.
Yeah. Um, so I often find that students not only have a difficult time talking to me as a professor, but even building relationship with each other. In fact, at
Mhm.
some, it's easier for them to talk to me compared to them building relationship with each other. And when you teach public health, you can't teach
Mhm.
community health without them experiencing community.
Mhm.
And so I am thinking about, how can I use this workshop at the beginning so that the students, even before I get
Yes.
into, the foundations of community health, to get the students to understand we have to, for a community to exist, you need to have ownership.
Mhm.
You cannot have a community if it isn't my community. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Mhm.
And I would love to hear your ideas. I mean, I think you are teaching too. So, what are the different contexts within which you have, used this approach to get the students to open up and belong? Because it has a huge impact on learning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I do actually, in my Intro to Community Engaged Scholarship class, I start every first day of class, we do a story circle around this question, what does home taste like to you? And ask, and for me, like that question is a great entry point into helping students reflect on their own home communities, where they're coming from, and how that might influence how they're engaging with the greater Rochester community. So I haven't actually done it with the story seeds themselves. I just have them write it on sticky notes. But we use that then to help them. And like students have reflected back to me that in that this 20-30 minute exercise, they've learned more about their fellow students than they know about some of their peers who they've known for 3 or 4 years. Like because of the focused attention that that story circle has. It's a different way of listening and sharing. And so I think storytelling also requires attention. And I think that emphasizing the attention when we're sharing stories is so important. And it matters of how we show up for our community partners too, and how we listen to them. So that's been a critical part of my syllabus.
Well, you're inspiring me.
Oh, I'm excited. I want to hear about how you incorporate this with your students. Um, and I am seeing like we have 2 minutes left. So with that being said, I'm just going to share my screen very briefly one more time. But please do, I don't know if my contact information is included in, I can drop it in the chat. But please do send me an email if you're interested in collecting and connecting more about this work. Um, and would love to hear about your questions, what you're like struggling with, what's working for you. If you are interested in reading more about the book, you can purchase a copy. 15%, I think I said 20% last week. It's actually 15% of all proceeds are donated to Baltimore-based nonprofits that are supporting the local food economy. The book has already raised more than $1,150 for these organizations. So you can purchase a book there. And then if you're interested in joining upcoming sessions, we have 2 more in the series. Next week, we'll be talking about the responsibility and ethics of storytelling and community engaged scholarship. So as I mentioned earlier, my husband, Michael, the photographer for the book, will be joining us for that conversation. And then the last week, we'll be talking about growing practices of collective care. And so how the scholarship community engagement work can really be a practice of of relationship building.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining and spending this past hour with us.
Megan, thank you so much. I am really looking forward to the next 2 sessions. I could have talked to you. I had questions about data, so can't wait to connect further on that. I did get confirmation, an email will be going out to those that registered for the first session tomorrow with the recording for the first session. I have also have a request for folks that weren't registered for the first session. We will send out the recording for after this session. It will go out next Monday, and I will have them add a link to the first session's recording in that email as well. So you'll have the first 2 recordings also in the recording for this week's session. So anybody that wants to catch up can also catch up for those 2. And Megan, if you're okay with it, can we include your email if folks want to get in touch with
Absolutely,
you?
please. Yes.
We will, not to put you on the spot or anything, we'll include that in the follow-up emails as well. Thank you all for staying on with us a minute past, and we look forward to seeing those of you that can make it with us next week for Story Seeds.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you, everyone.